In this block behind me, block 86, was where we started a Mandarin service at the home of Mr. P.S. Chong. His daughter Gina now plays the organ at the Mandarin service in Queenstown Lutheran Church. But he and his wife opened their house to Pastor Yong Dao Tung and myself, and we would come here and have services in their home, to which they would invite their neighbors or other people around to come. And so it was a simple house meeting with music and prayer, scripture reading, and some short message. Pastor Yong Dao Tung was very good at this and getting the people together and giving them a message of encouragement and hope and helping them to understand the good news of Jesus Christ. So the Chong family were one of the first families of the church here in Queenstown, and still members there. Their son also attends Jacob. He attends the English service, and Gina is in the Chinese, in the Mandarin congregation. So we have the next generation. And Mr. Chong, P.S. Chong, he was a tour guide in Singapore, and he would do the tour guiding for the Japanese. He spoke very fluent Japanese. So when we started the language classes in the Jurong Church, he had the Japanese classes. He taught the Japanese classes. And he had quite a few people that came and wanted to learn Japanese in those days, because some of the Japanese factories were coming into Singapore and people were visiting Japan. So that was a very useful ministry too, and got a lot of people acquainted with the church through Mr. Chong's ministry teaching Japanese. And you can see these first 4 units. In Queenstown, this is one of the older housing estates, so they had apartments on the first floor. If you go to the newer estates, this ground floor is always void. It's a void deck. There are no one living there. But in the Queenstown, when they built the Queenstown, the ground floor was occupied and there were apartments there. I think the idea was at that time, they wanted to get as many apartments built as they could for the housing of the people. They needed that. So we would have our open meeting along the corridor, in one of the houses, using one of the houses for the ministry. And then in an open area like this, Pastor Yang would come out here and play his accordion and make some music, and we would attract the children. They would come down and we would tell them Bible stories. We would have charts with pictures of the Bible story and tell them, and then hand them out little pictures so they could take home, and then tell them about our Sunday school at the church. So we had open air Sunday schools, just any place we'd stop. We could just stop and then play the accordion and gather children and then move on to another place. So we would do that a couple of times a week. So the open areas, it was a very easy access. We could go around and visit any place, or we could just stop and start a ministry with the children. So on this side were all the schools. For the Queenstown were all the schools right there in the center, and so it was very convenient for the families. So all the kids could walk to school. They all had close elementary and primary schools, and on this side was all the housing estates. So it was the way the ministry got started and developed. Okay, yes, earlier I spoke of how the Queenstown Church had an ideal location that we could see was built right in the center of this neighborhood that had all these apartment buildings going right around the church. So you could see that from this particular vantage point, how these apartment buildings surround the church, come around the church, going around on all sides, sweeping over here. So people coming out of their apartments, when they come out of their apartments and looking straight ahead, they see the church is standing right there. And the church has a cross. The cross is on each end of the church, so they would actually see the cross. And if they had any understanding, would relate that to Christianity and to God's love for them. We're seated in the sanctuary of Queenstown Lutheran Church. This church was dedicated in 1966. It was the first of the Lutheran churches that were built in housing estates. The Singapore Improvement Trust and then later on the Housing Development Board both had the idea of putting religious sites in the housing estates. And the Queenstown was the first new town that Singapore Improvement Trust built. And our Lutheran church got the religious site in Neighborhood 3. And that's where this church is built. It's an ideal location, and the church in America that sent the missionaries here could see the advantage of having a church here, because you're surrounded by 30,000 people living here, and a good number of them, when they come out of their apartments in the morning, they look out and the church is sitting right there, right before them. So it was an ideal location. The only church in such a large concentration of people. And so there was no congregation here, but the Lutheran Church in America that had sent the missionaries to work in Singapore saw the advantage or the opportunity of having a Lutheran church here, and so the funds were given to build this church. So the church was built without a congregation. And of course, then the ministry started. The other thing that helped, well, here is a couple of pictures of the dedication. This one where the plaque that says about the church is now at the head of the staircase when you come up. It used to be outside there, and then this was what the church looked like. And you can see how it's right in the center of all of these apartment buildings, that it sits right there, an ideal location. And so a great opportunity to reach out to so many people with the gospel. And of course, the church also could serve the people in many ways. We had a kindergarten right from the beginning here. We got a couple of the young people from the congregation to be our teachers in the kindergarten, although they had no experience as teachers, were not qualified, but they could teach ABCs, and they could teach the numbers, they could teach the songs to the children, and then we bought a number of tricycles, and so we had those down there in the covered space. So during the break time, the children could come out and ride tricycles around, which they couldn't do. There was no opportunity for them to do that anyplace else. The church then also was in effect a community center. There was no community center built in this area in the beginning. So the church could serve the people with different programs. So we had some sewing machines, and Betty Lou would teach sewing. They would have cooking classes in the kitchen. We had some members that spoke Japanese, and we had Japanese language classes. We had a lot of outside activity sports for the young kids. The parking lot was made into a basketball court. We had movable basketball goals at each end of the. A young man from America was our youth worker, and he was very athletic. He organized all of the children around here by age group into basketball teams, and he had a regular basketball program. So every night the lights were on in the parking lot, and children were out there playing basketball till we turned the lights off at 10 o'clock. And I think there's a picture here. There's a picture showing the basketball, the tip off of the goal. And Bill Baum was the man's name that did the youth work here and the teams. Not only we had basketball teams here, but he also organized softball teams. And we had a team playing in the Singapore Softball League from our youth fellowship. So we were in the third level of the softball teams. Actually, one year we won the championship for the third level. And we called them the Bombers because the young man's name was Bill Baum, B-A-L-M, but it sounded like bombers. So we called them the Bombers, the Queenstown Bombers, and they won the championship the 1 year of the softball team. So all those programs. In addition, one of the big programs we had in the in the early or in 60s and 70s was Taekwondo classes, which were very popular in Singapore at that time. We got the instructors from the Chinese YMCA, and we paid them a salary, and they came and ran the classes. And many of our members were enrolled in the classes together with others around here. So we had about 300 people coming in those classes every week. So through the kindergarten, the classes for the community, the Taekwondo classes, we had a lot of people passing through here. They knew the church, and we would be able to contact them, to talk with them, and to answer their questions, to go visit them in their homes and invite them to join the church. So in this way, the church grew. And as anticipated, because of the closeness of the people and many people, the congregation grew rather rapidly and became a strong congregation of the Lutheran Church in Singapore. One of the programs we had that was very fruitful was the Boys Brigade. Here is pictures showing the Boys Brigade watching there. This was the 26th company of the Boys Brigade, and we were fortunate to have some of the members of the congregation who had been in the Boys Brigade and had training as officers to begin those classes. So the Boys Brigade classes became very productive for the church. One of the church members from the United States who was here doing engineering work, he was very interested in wood carving. And so he got the Boys Brigade that were interested, the boys were interested, and taught them how to carve wood. And Casey Tan, who was a member of the congregation, his family ran a furniture shop, and they had a lot of pieces of scrap wood that they didn't use. So Casey would bring that wood here, and they would carve the wood up into different designs and so on. And so it became a good hobby and a good skill to learn. We had a group of women that made the banners. You could see many banners hanging around the walls of the sanctuary. This ministry has continued, and people here still make these banners. So they see those, each banner has some message in it to teach us. So many ways the gospel is put into programs. We put the gospel into a basketball program. We put the gospel into Taekwondo. We put the gospel into art, into sewing, into cooking, into language classes. In many ways, then the love of God was proclaimed out to people living in the Queenstown area. And this church grew, as I said, rather rapidly. We had good choirs. You can see in the choir, it's not just Singaporeans in the choir. There are some people from overseas that were working in Singapore, and they also were in this church and the choir. The choir director actually is one of those women who was helpful there.
About the Chinese congregation.
And yes, I'm speaking mostly of the English congregation, but the Chinese congregation was the same. This picture shows Mrs. Oy and Gina, her daughter. We actually started when this church was being built. We were visiting, of course, in the area. The government would not let us build the church until the contractors had finished building all of the HDB flats, because in other areas there had always been a conflict between the different contractors. And so they said they wanted to finish their building first, and then our contractor could come in and do the church. And so before we had the church, then we would be visiting, and there are different Christian homes. They would open their home, and we would have home meetings where they would invite their neighbors or the people that were Christian to come, and we would have church services in their homes. So we had a number of those scattered all around in the flats in this area. Then the contractor who was building this building, he built for us just a small wooden shed with a zinc roof right out here in the parking lot, and had a wooden floor. And so every Sunday evening, we would have the children come for Sunday school, and then we would have a short church service. So of course the children out here had nothing to do. You know, there was no outside activities for them. So
No
it was
television.
no television, and so they would come. We gathered children quite quickly, and we could have small services or teach them Sunday school songs. So many people became acquainted with the church and appreciated the things the church was doing for them, and asked, "Why are you doing this?" And our response was, "God, because of God's love for them." So we served here from '66 until '72 when we went to transfer to help in the ministry in Jurong Christian Church. Originally when we had the church, we had the altar out here. This platform that the altar is on is movable, and so we had the altar in the center. It was the idea to have a church in the round, that the people sat all around the altar like that. So this was the way church. And then we had a balcony there, and we had the organ, and the choir would be up there in the balcony. And so it was a church in the round in that sense. And I can remember one time we were having an ecumenical meeting, and it was being held in a Roman Catholic church. And when we went to that church, the young people, one of them said to me, it was actually Edmund Lim, and said to me, he said, "How come they have the altar at the end of the church and not?" Because the only church he'd ever been in was this church, where the altar was in the center. Later on, the congregation decided to do the same here and move the altar this way. That way they could expand out into the parish hall that way for the seating. So they did move the altar at one end of the church later on. And if you sit out there some places, you can find the connections for the microphones come up through. They're out there in the mosaic floor. Okay, we'll just talk about a few of the members of this congregation that we can recall, some of the early members. One couple would be Richard and Rebecca Koo. They were actually members at Redeemer Church. They were married in Redeemer Church, but they lived in this area. So when the church was opened here, then they became members of the Queenstown Lutheran Church. So they were always very active. Rebecca was in the choir, and Richard would just do everything in the church. So they were very active with the youth fellowship and kind of mentored a lot of the young people that were here.
They were also very friendly with our children. And when we had a baby in the family, Richard was always carrying the baby around. And Chinese New Year Eve, they would always invite our family with 7 children and have a meal for us to celebrate the Chinese New Year, because they had no children of their own. So we have enjoyed knowing them through the years. We've kept up our relationship all this time.
Another one was Joyce Leet. Joyce was a member of a Lutheran church in Malaysia, and she came to Singapore, and she didn't have a job, and she attended service. At that time, we were looking for someone to be a secretary of the church. So I asked her if she would like to do that. She said she had no experience in secretarial work, but we said, that's all right. We're just starting. Nobody will know the difference. So she came and she answered the phone. She learned to type and did all of the ministry of being there in the church all the time. So Joyce Lee became the first church secretary. Later on, she met a young man in this congregation, and they were married, and now she and her children are attending this church also.
So their son, Gabriel, asked me the other day, he says, why do I call you Mrs. Nelson, but all the young people at Baduk call you Grandma Nelson? And I said, because when we served here at Queenstown, we were young. And when we served at Baduk, we were much older.
So you became a grandmother.
It's fun to keep up relationships as these children all grow. And we had a family near here Jelly's family.
Jelly Tan.
Yeah, they had
7 or 8 children.
Yeah, they had a lot of children, and all the children came to our Sunday schools and were quite active. There was another family too with the girls.
Yos.
And now Rosalind is still a member here, but all those girls were always in the choir. They were a very
good
musical family.
Yes, and some of them were very athletic. One of them was a very good softball player. We had the different ones. Then there was a Lim family that lived right a block over there, and Edmund Lim, one of the sons of that family, he became a pastor in the Lutheran Church and served here in Lutheran churches in Singapore for some years before he migrated to the United States, where he still serves in the Lutheran Church as a pastor. His brother is still a member of the congregation and active here. Another member I can recall was a girl by the name of Jade Ton. She came one evening. We had services in the evening at 6 o'clock, and it was a very simple kind of service. We would sing songs or hymns together, read scriptures, and then I would always have a message, and we'd have prayers. So it was easy to come in, and you didn't have to know anybody. You didn't have to be a Christian to be. So she came into the service, became interested, and invited her sister to also come to the service. They later were both baptized. So there were a number of young men and women from here that went into the gospel ministry. Beilu could tell you about some of the members in the Mandarin congregation that she knew when they were little boys, and she knew them in Malaysia.
Fu Kong, he came here from Malaysia, and I knew him as a young man when we were living in Malaysia in 1955 to 60, and I would go out to Balakong New Village to have a clinic 3 times a week. And Fu Kong and his brothers were sometimes my translators, but they were all very young at that time, so it was a good connection for me when they came down here, and we renewed our friendship down here.
Yes, the Chinese pastor here, Pastor Tong Chu Wing, had been a pastor in Balakong New Village. And then when he had served in Malaysia 10 years, the government would not renew his visa. He was originally from Hong Kong. And so he was transferred to work in Singapore. So he came to be the pastor of the Chinese congregation, the Mandarin congregation here in Queenstown Lutheran Church. And so these young men in the village, when they would finish schooling, they didn't have any opportunity for work. So he would invite them to come down and stay with him while he would help them look for a job here in Singapore. And so quite a few, maybe a half a dozen or 10 of those young men from Balakong New Village came to Singapore through the ministry of Pastor Tong. And several of them are still members of this congregation. One of them became a pastor and is a pastor in Yishun Christian Church. He is Chong Fu Kong's brother. So we had that connection with Lutherans from Malaysia coming to Singapore. Yeah. Quite a lot of interesting stories of people from this congregation. So I maybe should get this side, so I can say, originally when the church was built, we had the altar here in the center, so that platform is movable, so it used to sit here. And then the congregation would sit around the altar. They would sit around the altar so that the altar was in the center. It was, some churches are built like that. The idea is that we gather around the altar of Christ, as a communion of saints, that we're seated around. Instead of having the altar and it looks kind of like a movie theater or a presentation where everybody is facing one way, then when you sit around the altar, you see the other members of the congregation on the other side. So it was built in that manner. And then originally, it wasn't air conditioned, and we had just had fans along the ceiling right here. So it was quite warm, I might say. Even though it has a high ceiling, it still would be quite a warm building because there were no open windows on the side. So the air conditioning has contributed a lot. It's made it a more useful building, and I think then more comfortable for people to come. Of course, we don't want the people to get too comfortable in church. Huh? We say that part of the ministry of the pastor is to comfort the afflicted, but to afflict the comfortable, to make the comfortable do something, get them not to be comfortable seated in church, but to be active in the church. So that's been the ministry here, what we've had. And it was like that. Then the church was built so that there used to be sliding doors back at the back, and then on the other side was the parish hall. So those doors could be opened up so that you actually could have seating clear back into the parish hall. Now they have 2 services in the morning at this in this congregation, so that they don't need so much seating because if everybody was here, it'd be way full. But then with the 2 services, then it's easier to leave it like this. Then you don't have to open the back doors. But underneath this carpet, there's a mosaic of the Luther Rose. Yeah, in the original flooring, which was that mosaic flooring. Then here there was a mosaic with the Lutheran Rose. And there was some objection to that because it said in ancient times when the church was being persecuted, they would have a cross on the floor, and they would make, if the Christians would not step on the cross, they would know they were a Christian. But if they would renounce Christianity, they could step on the cross. And so then during the times of persecution, this was how they would determine the Christians. So some people objected to our putting the Luther Rose here, because in the center of the heart is a cross, you know. So there you can see a picture of it on that banner over there, the Luther Rose. And so, but underneath the carpet here now, so they can step on it, you'll see it. And these are the original pews that were in the building, 19, they're very comfortable. And the original altar and pulpit, the baptismal font, they're all with the same design. This area over here was the church offices, and originally we had 2 residences over here for the pastor. On the ground floor, the youth worker stayed, and upstairs was a pastor's residence that had 2 bedrooms, a nice, comfortable residence, and very convenient. This was before we used to provide residences for the pastors in the Lutheran church. But then later on, with the Housing Development Board, everybody owned their own apartment, so that was no longer necessary. Now that residence has become part of the office for the administration of the church. And this was the original dedication plaque for the church that used to be at the front entrance here in 1966. Queenstown Lutheran Church, dedicated to the glory of God, 1st of May, 1966. And we have it in English, Chinese, and Malay. So you say, because at that time we had a Batak congregation here also at the beginning. See, one of the part of the character's gone off there. And I'm missing part of the 66. Part of the 6 is gone. Actually, you know, the parking lot isn't as large as it used to be because they built a new addition there. This area here used to be the parking lot for the church, and this is where we had our basketball courts in those days, huh? We had the basketball, and we had the lights up. So out here at night, kids would be playing basketball, and had a lot of children around here in those days. Now it's into a nice parking lot. In the original, when the church was built, we didn't need much parking lot because the members all lived in this area, were very close. We had a few members that lived outside that would come by car, but not many. So the parking lot was really not used for parking that much. Now it's quite different. A lot of the people who were members at Queenstown and have grown up and married, they don't live in the Queenstown anymore. They may live somewhere else, but they still return here for church. So in addition to those living around here that are members, Queenstown membership is outside of Queenstown. But originally we didn't need the parking lot, like I said. So we just made it into a basketball court. Make it more useful. The temporary shed was right in this area because of course the church was over here. So they had built that temporary wooden shed was right here close to the gate out there. And that's where it sat, right there. So he had that. So it was right on the edge of the basketball court. It was quite large. It was maybe as big as 3 parking lots. And it was just open on the sides. There was no walls. So it just open on the sides and it had a zinc roof, on it, on the top. So it was very simple. But it was enough shelter for us. Then we had some simple benches and chairs there for the children and the people that wanted to come and listen. And we had a field organ at that time that you could pump, not a piano, but an organ. And then we'd set it up, and then Barry Lou would play a pump the organ. So the music would attract people. They would come for that.